Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome Samuel Gregg, Director of Research at the Acton Institute, Fellow at the Royal Historical Society, and author of many books on economics and religion, including his most recent, Tea Party Catholic. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Sam, I asked you to join us for our Easter show because I'm a big fan of the Acton Institute, despite my own atheism. I've never heard a Catholic priest talk about economics the way your boss, Reverend Robert Sirico, does. For listeners who may not know about you, tell us a bit about the Acton Institute.
Well, the Acton Institute was founded 25 years ago, as it happens, because my boss, Father Sirico, and a Catholic layman who was an economist, were very frustrated with what they heard in seminaries, what they heard from the pulpit, when it came to Christians talking about the economy. Because there was a lot of emphasis at the time upon things like redistribution and emphasis upon things like social justice, the usual types of phrases that you often hear. But there was very little attention to, first of all, that if you're going to distribute wealth, you need to create it in the first place. It's a sort of rather elementary thing, but, a lot of Christians, particularly clergy, find that somewhat of a revelation. The second thing is that, of course, that the process of engaging in wealth creation is not a morally neutral thing. Many people think of the economy, they think of business, they think of the business of wealth creation as being a sort of, it's a neutral thing, it's important, but not that important. And they were saying, no, there's something here about wealth creation, about business, about free enterprise, about free markets, that is important, obviously, economically, but there's a lot of other things going on in the economy which speak to something about the human person that goes beyond just the material dimension. So when, for example, you're an entrepreneur, you create something, there's something really profound about that because no other creature can really do something like that. So their point was to say we need to educate clergy, and not just Christian clergy, but people from Jewish backgrounds, for example, about the moral potential of free enterprise and the free market, and also basically understanding economics, because I think if you understand economics, particularly free market economics, then that clears up a lot of problems when it comes to understanding what's the role of government, what's the role of business, what's the role of the market in creating a society in which wealth is created, but also people are happier.
So, Sam, why do you believe religious liberty and economic freedom are joined at the hip?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One is I think that freedom tends to be indivisible. And one diminution of freedom in a particular realm of life, whether it's in terms of the state or in terms of religion or the economy, tends to have negative implications for another. Because I like to say that when you shrink freedom in one sphere of life, that tends to have negative implications for freedom in another sphere of life. By the same token, when you expand freedom in one sphere of life, like in the economy, that can have very positive implications for freedom in other parts of life. A good example, of course, is China. China has experienced a sort of limited opening to the market economy and globalization over the past, almost 40 years now. And one of the very interesting things that's happened, I think, in those parts of China where they have opened themselves to the economy is that you've seen an expansion of interest in religion. You've seen people turning to religion to explain different things about life that they have not thought about before, but also people starting to demand a certain degree of religious freedom. And remember, China is still officially a communist state. It's still officially an authoritarian state. It officially, in terms of the Communist Party there, has a relatively negative view of religion. But when I think you open up the economy, that opens up people's minds so that they start asking questions that go beyond economic life. That's a very practical story about how an expansion of freedom in the economy has had some unanticipated side effects for the Chinese regime, because now they're having to cope with the fact that there are millions of people in China who are converting to Christianity, evangelical Christianity, Catholic Christianity. And I don't think that's a coincidence in a society which was used to a fair amount of repression in every sphere of life for a long period of time.
Well, give people a little freedom, and next thing you know, they want more.
Exactly. And it's hard to sort of say, no, that's enough. You can't have any more freedom, or you can't have freedom in this sphere of life. You can do it here, but you can't do it there. It's hard for people to stop And they shouldn't stop, actually, when it comes to thinking about freedom in this way.
Let me go back and challenge you a little bit on some of the fundamentals.
Sure.
Altruism is often cited as the foundation of Judeo-Christian morality, and the dictionary definition of altruism is the unselfish concern for or devotion to the welfare of others. That is, it values the other above the self. How do you square that with rational economics, which is all about how voluntary exchange driven by self-interest creates prosperity and progress?
Well, a couple of things. Just dealing with the self-interest issue, for example. There's self-interest and there's selfishness, and the two are not necessarily the same. I like to talk in terms of rational self-interest. What's rational for the self to desire, to want, to aspire to? Selfishness is something quite different, because selfishness, classically speaking, is when we irrationally focus upon a particular aspect of life, be it the economy, or be it politics, or power, or sex, or whatever it happens to be. And we start to desire something more than it's actually worth. So that's the first thing. I think there's a legitimate distinction that can be made between rational self-interest as well as this issue of selfishness. On the other hand, I think it's also clear that a market economy is not sufficient for a good society or a free society. It's indispensable. It's absolutely indispensable for a free society. You must have the capacity to engage in voluntary free exchange. But that won't solve all of society's problems. In fact, as I often say to people who are Christians, who are Jews, who are believers, I often say, markets are fantastic when it comes to creating wealth and growth, but they won't save your soul. There's things that voluntary exchange won't answer. And you just said there about altruism being a foundation of, say, Judaism and Christianity. That's true in the sense that love is seen as being at the basis of both religions to different degrees. But altruism is also an outcome of these religions as well, because these religions teach people to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, altruism, I think, needs to be distinguished from the sort of sentimental humanitarianism whereby you just start viewing people as helpless, they need to be helped with everything, that they're beyond doing things for themselves. Christian altruism is very much about helping people to get into a position whereby they can transform their own lives. Because if you take the other approach, you end up creating the problem of dependency, which is why Christian altruism, just like self-interest, has to be guided by an attention to reason. Once you throw reason out the door, then self-interest can very easily degenerate into irrational selfishness, and altruism can degenerate into things like expansive welfare states or excessive regulation, whereby you stop thinking rationally about how you help people and you just emote in the way that you think and talk about these things.
You've written extensively about the rule of law and the importance of impartial justice in creating a thriving economy, but doesn't Christianity elevate mercy over justice? Aren't we implored to forgive our debtors, not hold them into court?
Well, that's a very good point, because I think at the moment within, for example, the Christian church and even more specifically within the Catholic Church, there's a tremendous emphasis upon mercy. And mercy, of course, is when one goes beyond justice. It doesn't obviate justice. It doesn't destroy justice. What mercy does is remind us that the people we are dealing with are human beings, and that justice, just strictly applying justice to any number of situations, can sometimes result in a lot of harshness, a lot of great difficulties in society. But by the same token, if mercy is separated from justice, and I sometimes worry about this with regard to some of my fellow Christians, then mercy gets detached from what's right, mercy gets detached from what's reasonable, and you end up with a type of sentimentalism, because mercy does not extinguish our responsibilities in justice towards one another. Mercy is not a reason to obviate the rule of law. So I think these two things, there's a certain degree of creative tension between them. They inform one another. Mercy stops justice from becoming harsh and, in fact, in some respects, inhuman. But at the same time, an attention to justice means that mercy doesn't degenerate into a type of sentimental humanitarianism that's no longer capable of distinguishing between right and wrong.
Many left liberal activists try to solve this problem by focusing on what they call social justice, which is a
Right.
special version of justice that elevates equal outcomes above the impartiality of the market. How does Acton view equality and social justice?
Well, that's a subject, as you can imagine, we've been talking a lot about for the past 2.5 years. And one of the things we often say is that if there's equality in the sense of every person being made as the imago Dei, in the image of God, that's very much the Jewish and Christian tradition when it comes to thinking about the roots of equality. No person is intrinsically worth more than another. But that is not incompatible with unequal outcomes. In fact, if you think about it just from the standpoint of justice, there are plenty of unjust, unequal outcomes. If someone works harder, for example, than another person, then all other things being equal, they're usually entitled to receive more of the return for taking more risk or working harder than the person who takes no risk or refuses to work. So I think when it comes to the understanding of economic outcomes, the Christian perspective, the Jewish perspective, is actually much more nuanced than a lot of people think, because some people think it does mean, well, everyone gets exactly the same. But that doesn't account for the attention that Judaism and Christianity pay, to example, to things like one's merit, what one earns, how hard one works, how creative one is, how much risk you are willing to take, compared to the person who doesn't want to take risk, who doesn't want to be creative, who's just content to more or less drift through life. And in that sense, I think, you see, there's an example of justice actually suggesting that, no, not all economic outcomes need be or should be equal.
Sam, much political hay has been made over the growing fortunes of the despised 1%. What role does envy play in economic morality?
Well, envy is a serious problem. And in fact, it's something that I worry that not enough Christian clergy or religious leaders from any faith do not talk enough about. In fact, in the Ten Commandments, it's listed as one of the things that one should never do. How does the envy play out economically? It plays out in several ways. It means that it tends to become the basis for thinking about that person has more than I have. Therefore, because I want that, because I'm envious of what they have, I am justified in using the state or voting for people who are willing to use the state to take from the other person to give to me. And I think that is not often stated out loud in contemporary politics, but I think if you dig beneath the surface, that's more or less a lot of the logic that you find when it comes to aspects of the redistributive state, to certain aspects of the welfare state. And envy in the end, of course, is deeply corrupting, not just of the political process, but of the people who are participating in the political process. You've heard the expression, green is envy, envy is green. It's this type of way in which envy takes over our lives and causes us to be constantly comparing ourselves to others rather than looking at ourselves and saying, okay, what do I need to do in my life to transform myself so that I can achieve the things that other people seem to have achieved in exactly the same type of circumstances? So envy, if it gets rooted in a society, if it gets rooted in an economy, can have very, very destructive effects upon that society and the economy. But even more importantly, it can fundamentally distort the way that people view themselves, other people, and the world around them in very, very negative ways.
Western cultural mores are certainly becoming more Dionysian. Where does guilt and shame fit in the picture?
Well, I often like to say that guilt and shame are different things. One can be genuinely guilty and feel no shame. Sometimes we are ashamed of things for which we have no reason to be guilty. But I would also say that a society in which people do not feel guilt, and by which I mean they don't feel responsibility for objective moral wrongs that they have done, that I think is heading very quickly in the direction of a very narcissistic, even psychopathic society. I often say to people, psychopaths feel no guilt about anything. guilt is actually a very natural thing. If you believe that human beings can know the difference between right and wrong, and that when they do wrong, they realize there's something fundamentally at odds with how they are supposed to be. Now, so I'm not talking about things like the way in which some people take on burdens internally that they have no reason to. I'm not talking about things like when people feel guilty for what their parents did or their grandparents did or what their country did. I'm talking much more about the sense that I have done something wrong, and until I'm willing to acknowledge I've done something wrong and put it right, I'm going to have this distinct feeling of ill-at-easeness about myself. Shame can be a different thing. On the one hand, I think in many respects, a society that doesn't use shame as a way of expressing its disapproval of things that are clearly wrong will often have resort to an overmighty state to take care of any number of problems. So there's all sorts of problems, I think, in society that we would be better off dealing with by basically shunning people rather than simply using the legal code against them. On the other hand, a lot depends upon the cultural state of society, because there are things which societies will often try and make people feel ashamed of, for which they really have no reason to. So, for example, in much of Western Europe, for example, and I've talked about this in some of my books, there's a sense that if you are wealthy or you have made money, you should somehow be ashamed of that.
You need to
hide that. Now, that's different, of course, from someone who's sort of ostentatious about what they have and what they own and what they've achieved. That's equally undesirable as well. But shame can take very negative forms when it's used as a way to denigrate genuine achievement. And for some reason in our society, we don't denigrate people who are successful in sport. We tend not to denigrate people who are successful in politics. But we have a very bad habit of denigrating people who have been successful in the economy. And of course, when you're successful in the economy, there's two ways to do it. One is either through creating wealth and offering goods and services that consumers actually want. On the other hand, you can achieve wealth through getting close to government, getting close to politicians, and basically trying to rig the system in your favor. So that's a good example where shame should not be applied to the person who's genuinely creative and has built wealth, which of course doesn't just benefit them, it benefits everyone, as opposed to the person who uses the state to get what they want from the economy. But you see, in both those cases, what you need is some sort of moral compass that tells you that this form of shame is appropriate and this is not.
Sam, free market economics is primarily focused on human flourishing and prosperity here in this life. Why does that matter if in the end what's more important is earning a place in heaven or avoiding damnation to hell?
Well, of course, the Christian and Jewish perspective is that you can't earn your way into heaven. You can't sort of achieve your way into heaven. At least the Christian perspective is that to a certain extent we rely upon God's grace, God's mercy, that because none of us can really work our way into heaven. In fact, that was one of the very earliest Christian heresies. It was called Pelagianism, that you could somehow, through your own actions alone, work your way into heaven. But the way I like to describe the relationship is this, that when one uses one's talents in good ways, when one, for example, builds businesses, when you create wealth, which of course you literally don't consume all by yourself.
Right.
The wealth goes on to be invested in capital in your own business. It basically moves its way throughout the economy, making life better for everyone. That in some way is a type of prefiguration. It's a way of saying that I am contributing in some way to the building up of the way life was meant to be. So in that sense, what I do is, it's not building heaven on earth. It's building a type of world that prefigures what Christians certainly believe is the world to come. So in other words, one flourishes in this life, for example, by building a business, by being very active in the economy. And that's a way of saying that I'm making some type of contribution to a better world, but a better world which I know will never be fully realized in this life. And I'm sure one of the temptations, as I'm sure you know, that a lot of religious people face is that we tend to fall into the trap of either completely condemning this world and saying that we want nothing to do with it, or on the other hand, falling into soft forms or even hard forms of utopianism, where people literally try to build heaven on earth. That's why I often say things like Marxism in many respects was more or less a type of Christian heresy. It tried to build heaven on earth. So I think an authentically Christian approach to the issue that you're describing, it's very much a creative tension. You want to avoid the sense that the world is eternally bad and want it to be avoided, but you've also got to avoid the sense that somehow utopia is possible in this world. And that's a very difficult balance to keep, and a lot of Christians fall over into one camp or the other at different parts of their lives. So in terms of avoiding damnation, the way one avoids damnation, of course, is by, for a Jew or for a Christian, is by following the moral law that is not just revealed to us through the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, but as people like St. Paul said, it's written on our hearts. It's in the natural law that, as Paul says, even the Gentiles can know what is good and evil through the law written on their hearts, by which he meant human reason. So some people would say that, well, a non-believer can know good and evil by virtue of this natural law that's written on their hearts, simply because it's intrinsic to our reason itself. So I think maintaining that type of balance between looking towards heaven, but also being very conscious that one lives in a fallen world, I think that is very important for a Christian who's serious about trying to realize heaven while avoiding what you described as damnation.
Sam, you recently wrote a fascinating article titled God, Reason, and Our Civilizational Crisis. And in it you state that the Islamic world is struggling with a particularly virulent God problem. It's a complicated piece to talk about on the radio, but try to boil it down for us, particularly the connection between Islam's view of the deity and jihadist violence.
Well, I think one of the fundamental problems facing contemporary Islam is a theological problem, which we in the West seem reluctant to talk about, but we are talking about a religion, and religion does involve a certain degree of theology, whether one likes it or not. And part of the problem is that Islam tends to view God, the divinity, as pure will, not as reason, not as divine reason, which Judaism and Christianity, while they view God as love, they also view God as divine reason. That's very clear if you read, for example, the Christian Gospels, even the Greek words that are used to describe aspects of God's nature
Logos.
In the Christian Gospels as well as in some Jewish writings. They use the phrase logos. What does logos mean? Logos means divine reason. So here's the point. If your God is one of untrammeled will, who just wills things rather than reasons about things, then that God can command us to do unreasonable things, and I can't question whether that God is asking me to do the right thing. That is a major problem when it comes to this issue of Islamic violence, because if you take the classic understanding of God that Islam has as divine will, then I can't argue if that God tells me to blow up a building or fly a plane into a building or to kill Jews in a kosher market in Paris earlier this year. I can't argue against that God. Whereas if you regard God as having the characteristics of divine reason, well, that means that I'm reasonable as well. And I can judge whether or not someone who is in a position of religious authority is commanding me to do something reasonable or something unreasonable. In other words, your understanding of God affects your understanding of who the human person is and what you think is reasonable actions on the part of that person and what you think are unreasonable acts on the part of that person. And by the way, you don't have to be a believer to see the connection between these different things, because if you do view God as just pure divine will, I think you have a problem. I think you have a major problem in terms of holding people accountable for things that they do in the name of religion that are clearly unreasonable. I think this is one of the problems that we find in much of the Islamic world. They're unable to articulate a critique of some of the people who do terrible things in the name of Islam because their understanding of God doesn't give them much room, I should say, to do so.
Sam, I could go all day with you. It's been very enlightening to chat. You have a happy Easter, and thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
That was Samuel Gregg, Director of Research at the Acton Institute, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. If you'd like to hear more, stop by realclearradio.org to sign up for updates on our weekly broadcast or access podcasts of our past programs. That wraps up our Easter show. Join us next week, same time, same station. See you then.